Ace Ventura, Pet Detective is a 1994 American comedy film starring Jim Carrey as Ace Ventura, an animal detective who's tasked with finding an abducted dolphin mascot of the Miami Dolphins football team. The film was directed by Tom Shadyac, who wrote the screenplay with Jack Bernstein and Jim Carrey. The film co-stars Courteney Cox, Tony Locke, Sean Young, and then Miami Dolphins quarterback Dan Marino, and features a cameo appearance from the death metal band Cannibal Corpse. Morgan Creek Productions produced the film on a budget of $15 million, and Warner Brothers released the film in February 1994. It grossed $72.2 million in the United States and in Canada, and $35 million in other territories for a worldwide total of $107.2 million. It received mixed reviews from critics. Carrey's performance led to the film having a cult following among male adolescents. In addition to launching Carrey's film career, it started a franchise spawning the sequel film Ace Ventura When Nature Calls in 1995. The animated television series Ace Ventura Pet Detective, which ran for 3 seasons from 1995 to 2000, and later a standalone made-for-television sequel called Ace Ventura Jr. Pet Detective in 2009. Years after its release, Ace Ventura Pet Detective received criticism for its portrayal of a transgender character. The chairman and CEO of Morgan Creek Productions, James G. Robertson, sought in the early 1990s to produce a comedy that would have wide appeal. Gag writer Tom Shadyac pitched a rewrite of the script to Robertson and was hired as director for what was his directorial debut. Filmmakers first approached Rick Moranis to play Ace Ventura, but Moranis declined the role. Then they considered casting Judd Nelson or Alan Rickman, and they also considered changing Ace Ventura to a female and casting Whoopi Goldberg as the pet detective. Ultimately, the producers noticed Jim Carrey's performance in the sketch comedy show In Living Color and cast him as Ace Ventura. Carrey helped rewrite the script, and the filmmakers allowed him to improvise on set. Carrey said on his approach, "I knew this movie was going to either be something that people really wanted to go for, or was going to ruin me completely. From the beginning of my involvement, I said the character had to be rock and roll. He had to be the 007 of pet detectives. I wanted him to be unstoppably ridiculous, and they let me go wild." He said he sought comedic moments that would be unappealing to some. "I wanted to keep the action unreal and over the top. And when it came time to my reaction to kissing a man, I wanted it to be the biggest, most obnoxious homophobic reaction ever recorded. It's so ridiculous, it cannot be taken seriously, even though it guarantees that somebody is going to be offended." The film has been criticized for many ways it's portrayed transgender people. Alexander Grossenbach Perkins wrote in the Representing Queer and Transgender Identity that mainstream representation of transgender identity as the turn of the 20th century was limited, observing, "The representations that did exist tended to pathologize transgender people as mentally unstable." Perkins said Ace Ventura, along with The Crying Game, depicted transgender characters as murderous villains. In the book Reclaiming Genders, in the chapter focusing on transgender identity, Georgina O. Mackenzie references Ace Ventura as an example of the turn-of-the-century films that illustrate transphobia implicit in many popular US films. Mackenzie describes the scene in which Ace Ventura retches in the bathroom following the revelation that the woman he had kissed is trans, and one of the most memorial and blatant transphobic, homophobic scenes in Hollywood history. In the New York Times in 2016, Farhad Manjoo also wrote about the scene. There was little cultural suspect about playing a gender identity for laughs. Instead, as in many fictional depictions of transgender people in that era, the scene's prevailing emotions is of nose-holding and disgust. Now, in my own opinion, I absolutely adore this movie. It's one of those movies that I grew up with, and it's one of those that I can watch over and over again. Jim Carrey is one of my favorite comedians of all time. He's definitely a guy that you either like or hate, but for me, I absolutely adore his style of comedy. In Ace Ventura, though, he is at his comedic best. For me, this character is completely bombastic, over the top, and frankly cannot be taken seriously for a moment. Now, although I completely agree that the scene in which he finds out that Lois Arnhorn is actually Ray Finkel, he completely overreacts, and that is the point. It's a complete overreaction. Carrey summed it up himself when he said it was the most obnoxious, homophobic reaction ever recorded. It is completely ridiculous that you cannot take it seriously. If anything, he is mocking homophobia. For me, this is one of those films I can watch over and over again. I just love Jim Carrey's performance here, and I love the references to the Miami Dolphins, the setting in Florida, and the way the whole story just plays out. I just think it is just truly hilarious, and one of those films for me that just never dates. I love that the character is pro-animals and loves animals and actually does his best to help them. I thoroughly enjoyed the way the story plays out and the twist at the end, of course. And the whole Ray Finkel story just fascinates me for some reason. The supporting cast are on point here, and Courteney Cox is perfect in her role. as Melissa Robinson, and her chemistry, of course, with Jim Carrey is off the charts. I also particularly liked Sean Young's take here as Lois Einhorn. It's not her best acting performance by any means, but she really sort of plays the antagonist quite well. Of course, this film is all about Jim Carrey, and like I said, if you don't like him, you're definitely not going to like this film. He's completely over the top, completely outrageous, but that's what makes it so hilarious. And it's just one of those that brings me back to my childhood and really loving it at the time. Like most humour, comedy is subject to your interpretation. It's not for everyone. Some people might find this funny, some people might find it offensive, and I can see firmly why some people would find it offensive. But for me, like I said, knowing Carrey, particularly the kind of comedian that he is, I don't think he went out of his way to offend people. I think he went out of his way to make a mockery of certain aspects of society. This movie has a cult-like status, of course, from the 1990s, and it's one of those movies that every time I happen to come across it, I just can't take my eyes off of it and end up watching the whole film. As I said, this is not for everyone, but for me it's one of my favourite comedy films of all time from one of my favourite comedy actors. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, gets a 9.5 out of 10.